The prophet Hosea said this, "When Israel was a child, I loved him." This is Yahweh speaking through Hosea. "I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." Out of Egypt I called my son. God the Father delivered his rebellious son from slavery. And we've been rehearsing this story quite a bit in different ways over the last month, in particular here in the season of Lent. And this morning we are going to look from the chronicler's perspective on the story of Scripture, from 2 Chronicles 36 all the way back. And so God the Father delivered his rebellious son from slavery. Out of Egypt, Israel passed through the waters, and on their way into the promised land by foot, which was a 2-week journey by foot, it took them 40 years. And now hear this from Leviticus 25, starting in verse 1. "The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai." And what did he say? He said this, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land I give you, the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years you shall sow the field, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its fruits. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land," a Sabbath to the Lord. And skipping down to verse 8 of Leviticus 25, "You shall count 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the time of the 7 weeks of years shall give you 49 years." Okay, just hold that in your head. It's a little confusing. It's math. You didn't expect to get math at church. So 49 years. "Then you shall sound the loud trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement you shall sound the trumpet throughout all your land, and you shall consecrate the 50th year. The 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, when each of you shall return." Each of you shall return. So, don't be confused, all right? The year of Jubilee, the 50th year. I don't know that Israel ever observed a Sabbath year. I don't know that. We don't really have a testimony specifically about it. I don't know that Israel ever observed a year of Jubilee. I do know that Israel was constantly restless. I know what it means to be restless. Even when I get to my destination, when I've finished my plan or accomplished the goal that I set out to do, even then, satisfaction is only for a brief moment. You beat that level in Mario, and then you got the next level, right? And then I'm restless again. I don't know that Israel ever truly observed a Sabbath day or week or Jubilee, but I do know that I live days and weeks and years with rhythms of time that are always drifting away towards restlessness. I'm always going that direction. Out of Egypt, Israel, God's son, is finally entering into the land, but they are restless. They finally have their king, but their first king, according to the chronicler, he is Ma'al. And I'm saying that word because it's a very important word for the chronicler. It just means unfaithful or breach of faith. They broke faith with the Lord. The first king that they were asking God for, that they received, they grabbed with a closed fist. They grabbed him. He was unfaithful. He broke faith with the Lord, and he dies right at the beginning of the chronicler's story. This is where the story begins. King Saul is dead, and we fast forward all the way through 1 Samuel straight to King David. Now, I know I mentioned Sylvester Stallone last week, but I have to do it again this week. I honestly don't ever remember watching a whole one of his movies ever, but I've seen enough movie trailers to know that Stallone pretty much blew up everything in the 80s and 90s. Like everything he came close to, he blew up. Just in case you missed the 80s and 90s though, in the last decade, Old man Stallone assembled every 80s and 90s action movie star, all with their wrinkles, and they're still way more buff than I'll ever be. And they made at least 3 more movies. There's probably more than that now. So if you like your stories with no plot and loaded with violence and explosions, you can watch Sylvester Stallone, or you could just read Chronicles. Like old man Stallone, King David assembles his mighty men from all Israel, and they immediately go blow a bunch of stuff up. The plot is pretty simple in the first part of the story, in First Chronicles. With all his mighty men, King David kills everyone, lays them to waste, and he takes all of their stuff. He brings back all the spoils of war. He gathers all the priests together in Jerusalem to worship God. And then he sets out to build the temple, or the house of the Lord, as the chronicler says. And then the unexpected happens. God tells David that he cannot build the house. He cannot build the house. The entire story of David's life is conquest in the power of God so that he can build the temple. Unite all Israel together and to worship God. That's it. That's his aim. That's his goal. And God says, you will not build my temple. I will build my own house. I will build my own house, says the Lord. I will establish your son after you on the throne forever. And this is the covenant with David. You see, like Moses, David dies never having seen the promise fulfilled. Just like Moses, he never sees the promise. Someone after him goes in and accomplishes the task. So this is the first part of the story of Chronicles. Every victory in battle, every sacrifice, every organizational plan points forward to this moment in 2 Chronicles chapter 1. All Israel is now united. They're all together. The mighty men are no longer mighty in battle, but the text says that they are mighty in worship in the assembly, in the church. David's son Solomon is on the throne, and he sings, I imagine him singing Psalm 127, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. And all the hopes of Israel are embodied now in David's son Solomon. He builds the house of God exactly according to the plan, with all the stuff that David's been gathering so that his son can build it. The earthly palace for the heavenly king is blessed. All the heads of the tribes, of all the priests, all the congregation, all Israel on their knees in prayer. All the Levitical singers with a loud voice singing songs of ascent as they go up. This is the scene at the beginning of 2 Chronicles. In order that all the people would come, as the Queen of Sheba comes to Solomon for his wisdom, all the peoples would be gathered in to bow before not just Solomon, the king, but the King of heaven, and to know and to love and fear the Lord. But the people, over and over again, in the chronicler's story, they are ma'al, they are unfaithful. They store up their treasure on earth, in earthly kings, in the physical temple, in the moment, in the land, in their stuff. They put their hope in their loud songs of praise and their fervent prayers. The son of David, Solomon, dies, and with him all hope is lost. The people no longer gather together to worship. The kingdom falls apart. It splits. Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Church splits. Kahal assembly splits. Go back a long way, people. They just planted that church. And now the sun, it splits. The house for God was just built, and immediately there is division in the house of David. Most of David's sons do evil, the text says, in the sight of the Lord. They are ma'al. They breach faith. They are unfaithful over and over again. Even the few good kings after David, like Solomon or Hezekiah or Josiah, they all fail. And so now we come to our sermon text in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, starting at verse 14. All the officers of the priests and the people likewise, just like the kings, likewise, were exceedingly unfaithful, following all the abominations of the nations. So our Old Testament reading this morning is on the very last, I have a physical prop, visual learners out here. It's on the very last page, which looks like the front page to you. The very last page of the Hebrew Bible. That's where our reading comes from, 2 Chronicles 36. The very last page of the Hebrew Bible. Looking back, the very first word of Chronicles is Adam. So it looks all the way back to Adam, all the way through all the kings. They were all ma'al over and over again. But it wasn't just the kings who were unfaithful. All the people, including the priests, especially the priests, they were not only ma'al. In our text, for the first time in all of Chronicles, they were exceedingly ma'al. So, exceedingly, here's the adverb, and then he repeats ma'al. Pretty bad. They were exceedingly unfaithful. The first king, Saul, was ma'al. Fast forward, and you and I and all Israel, all the assembly, were ma'al. You think it's just the leadership that are bad. All of us together are worse. Continuing in verse 14 of 2 Chronicles 36, they polluted the house of the Lord. Everything was aimed towards building this house. Everything was aimed towards it, and they polluted the house of the Lord that he made holy in Jerusalem. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent persistently to them by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they kept mocking. They kept mocking the messengers of God, despising his words and scoffing at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, until there was no remedy. There was no healing. The word just means, it's literally no healing. There was no healing left for God's son. So God sent his son to Babylon. The people wanted the abominations of the nations. They wanted them, so God gave them what they wanted. Therefore, the Apostle Paul says, God gave them up. He gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. They got what they wanted. God said, sure, there you go. Have Babylon. God's son was restless because he slept in the bed of a Babylonian prostitute. There was no healing, there was no remedy except to give his son up to Babylon and let him sleep in the bed of his own making. So now, hear Jeremiah 23. Jeremiah the prophet in chapter 23, verse 3. After all of this, I will gather the remnant of my flock out of all the countries where I have driven them, and I will bring them back to their fold, and they shall be fruitful and multiply. I will set shepherds over them who will care for them, and they shall fear no more, nor be dismayed, neither shall any be missing, declares the Lord. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch. So the imagery is of a cut-off tree, a tree that is gone. They're in exile. It's all gone. There's a stump, and a branch shoots up from this stump. A righteous branch for David, and he shall reign as king and deal wisely, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In his days Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell securely. And this is the name by which he will be called. Yahweh is our righteousness. This is his name. The Lord is our righteousness. Jeremiah the prophet of Josiah's restoration. He comes up in the last-ditch restoration of Josiah's kingdom. He watched as the sons of Solomon, of David, as the kings and the kingdom after Josiah crumbled to the ground and were taken into exile, and he wept. And this week in our Bible reading, we're going to read Jeremiah. There's a lot of weeping for good reason. But he did not grieve like one who has no hope. He didn't grieve as one who has no hope. The days are coming, Jeremiah says. The days are coming. The king will return. We will dwell securely, he preached. 2 Chronicles 36 and verse 20. So the king of the Chaldeans took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword.